United States constitutional amendments, 1 through 10.
The Bill of Rights.
Ratified December 15th, 1791.
I have been dying to talk about the USA Patriot Act, which was passed overwhelmingly in our Congress. And there's a lot in there that people object to. We could go through all the motions in the act, and we might get to it. But let me just ask first about the name. I find that to be dirty pool. To call an act the USA Patriot Act. Now, I know the Republicans and conservatives are always good at seizing the linguistic high ground. Pro-life, who could be against life? States' rights. It's not about blacks, it's about states' rights.
Then who could be against liberal? I mean, liberating. You know,
liberal. Well, somehow that got to be a dirty word. But who is going to not vote for the USA Patriot Act? You could be legalizing crack in that act.
How could Congress pass this Patriot Act without even reading it?
Sit down, my son. We don't read most of the bills. Do you really know what that would entail if we were to read every bill that we pass? Well, the good thing, it would slow down the legislative process.
I couldn't believe that virtually no member of Congress had read the Patriot Act before voting on it. So I decided the only patriotic thing to do was for me to read it to them.
Members of Congress, this is Michael Moore. I would like to read to you the USA Patriot Act. Section 1, Section 210 of the code reads as follows. Section 2713.
Exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people.
Of course, Congress people didn't even read it. They saw USA Patriot Act, they crapped their pants and voted.
It's when you name something.
Whose fault is that, though? It's not, you know, I mean, the congressman should have, it's a 30,000-word act, yes, you have, but, you know, that's what you're paid to do, is to read these acts.
That's what your staff is there to do and analyze it.
I can't believe it. It's less about the name and the content.
But it's all
But there are a lot of loopholes in the law, you know, and this is sort of a way of, you know, I mean, and terrorists are using those loopholes to exploit our own freedoms and against us. So it really, I mean, it's a temporary provision. This is something that's it's got a sunset rule that.
Right, in 2005.
This is up in 2005 and up for renewal.
What about? Hi. Okay.
Just a news.
All right, so we were talking about the Patriot Act, which again sticks in my craw just because of the title, but it is part and parcel of what people are doing nowadays in our government, which is trying to ram through things under the cover of 9/11. Now.
Okay, next. All right.
Second Amendment.
It's a young lady's turn.
A well-regulated militia.
All right, right here. Go ahead.
To the security of a free state.
Senator Obama, the youth of America and many Americans consider you a bright beacon of hope for the future, and you are a civil rights advocate. But could you please explain to me why you voted to reauthorize the Patriot Act, which is the worst attack on civil rights of Americans? And we do now know that George Bush's fabricated reasons to go to war were fabricated, so we do not need the Patriot Act to keep us safe.
Let me tell you what. First, it's not actually true that the Patriot Act was the worst. Most of the problems that we have had in civil liberties were not done through the Patriot Act. They were done through executive order by George W. Bush. And that's why the first thing I will do when I'm president is call in my Attorney General and have he or she review every executive order to determine which of those have undermined civil liberties, which are unconstitutional, and I will reverse them with a stroke of a pen. And so that is actually how That's actually how the worst abuses have occurred. That's what happened with Guantanamo. That's what happened with the warrantless wiretaps. That's what's happened with the suspension of habeas corpus. That's what's happened in terms of the rounding up of Americans of Muslim extraction. Those weren't done through the Patriot Act. Those were all...
Holy fuck! Oh my God! Oh my God!
And the irony is Rudy Giuliani, probably the most underqualified man since George Bush to seek the presidency, is here talking about any of the people here. Rudy Giuliani. I mean, think about it. Rudy Giuliani, there's only three things he mentioned in a sentence, a noun and a verb and 9/11. I mean, there's nothing else. There's nothing else. And I mean it sincerely. He is genuinely not qualified to be president. Here's a man who brags about how he made the city safe. It was the Biden crime bill that became the Clinton crime bill that allowed him to do that. They wipe it out. He remains silent. The 9/11 Commission comes along and says the way to keep your city safe is to do the following things. He's been silent. He's been done nothing.
Be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without consent of the owner.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to this bill. I was opposed to the Patriot Act in 2001 and do not believe now that it's a good idea to extend it.
And effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated.
Separately.
No warrants shall issue.
The first Patriot Act, I wasn't there, so I did not vote for that. The second one, I actually worked with Russ Feingold, who was one of the people who opposed it, to try to amend it to deal with some of its excesses.
You know, the Fourth Amendment is rather clear. It says that we should be secure in our papers, our persons, our homes, and our effects. And that if warrants are to be issued, we have to do it with probable cause and describe in particular the places, the people, and the things that we're going to look at. And I think what has happened, though, over the years has been that we have diluted the Fourth Amendment.
There were some provisions in the Patriot Act that actually did address changes that needed to take place. And let me give you a specific example. Prior to the Patriot Act, you could not wiretap a phone that wasn't land-based. Now think about it. Nobody uses a land-based phone anymore. Certainly, people who might be engaging in terrorism aren't going to be using an old dial-up phone, right? So it made sense then to change that law, and there were some other provisions that made sense. There were a number of provisions that went way overboard, including, for example, going through library records. We instituted a series of amendments that changed some of the worst excesses of the previous law. Some of the other amendments were blocked by the administration and the Republican Congress. But I want everybody to understand, you know, I taught constitutional law for 10 years. I take the Constitution very seriously. The biggest problems that we're facing right now have to do with George Bush trying to bring more and more power into the executive branch and not go through Congress at all. And that's what I intend to reverse when I'm President of the United States of America. All right. How much more time do we have? We got time for 2 more questions. All right.
was greatly diluted in 2001, but it started a lot earlier than that. When the FISA law was originally written in 1978, that really introduced the notion that the Fourth Amendment was relative and not absolute. And later on, it was further weakened in 98, and then, of course, in 2001. I think our reaction to the horrors of 9/11, we can understand the concern and the fear that was developed, but I think the reaction took us in the wrong direction, because the assumption was made, of course, that we weren't spending enough money on surveillance, and even though then our intelligence agencies received $40 billion, they didn't give us the right information. So now we're spending $80 billion. And also,
except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia, when in actual service in time of war or public danger, nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation.
As for Patriot 1, I won't try to review the content of it. I'm sure you know it. Instead of reviewing the content, I'll just quote a comment on it by one of the heroes of Bush, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz, and the rest. In his words, the power of the executive to cast a man in prison without formulating any charge known to the law, and particularly to deny him the judgment of his peers, is in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian governments, whether Nazi or communist. That actually is a pretty exact description of the content of Patriot 1. The man who wrote the words, George Bush looks at every morning. He has a bust on his desk of this revered figure given to him by his friend Tony Blair. The man's name is Winston Churchill, and he was warning about abuses of executive power for intelligence and preventive purposes. The year was 1943, when England was facing annihilation at the hands of the most murderous, brutal regime in history. But nonetheless, Churchill warned severely against the odious practices that are the foundations of all totalitarian governments, whether Nazi or communist, and that are enacted in Patriot 1 under far less onerous conditions. So Churchill's words place the Bush administration in its proper historical context, as their great hero perceives it, I think, quite accurately. Well, the act has been implemented, but there's been so much resistance to it that the implementation so far is against vulnerable, weak people. That's bad enough. Could be a lot worse, but they haven't been able to make it worse. It's been upheld by the courts to a large extent, the lower courts at least, who have agreed with the administration claim that the executive shall have the right to cast a man in prison without formulating any charge known to the law, to deny him the judgment of his peers, in Churchill's words, and to do it indefinitely, without charge, without access to family and lawyers, including American citizens, and at the whim of the executive.
And to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him,
executive branch agrees, as long as we have an executive that is committed to the policies that are in the highest degree odious and the foundation of all totalitarian governments, whether Nazi or communist.
The accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state.
Step by step, Americans are losing their grip on liberty. So says best-selling author Naomi Wolf.
The great dictators learned from one another what was essentially a blueprint for
I believe certainly that there's a fascist shift taking place, or rather that the foundation was laid during the Bush administration and that it has not been dismantled. Barack Obama is slowing things down, but Barack Obama campaigned on promises of restoring the rule of law, restoring the Constitution, rolling back, closing Guantanamo. And in many ways, the gestures he's made since he's been in office are symbolic. He committed to closing Guantanamo. I was there 2 weeks ago. They're building it up. That's right. They're military. He committed to restoring the rule of law. Military commissions are flatly illegal. They're running military commissions in Guantanamo for the alleged 9/11 terrorists and Omar Khadr, a Canadian detainee who was detained as a child. He hasn't rolled back the Patriot Act. The Patriot Act is still in force. The surveillance apparatus is still in force. For all we know, journalists were being surveilled under the Bush administration. For all we know, that's still continuing. He is pushing for preemptive detention, which is an absolute foundation stone of a police state. So we are by no means back to America, as the founders envisioned it, America premised on the Constitution, the rule of law. We're still in a very serious situation. What's frustrating, in a way, is that he does it so gracefully and so charmingly and so charismatically, saying all the right things, that I think many people have kind of stardust in their eyes about what actually has not changed, and in some ways gotten worse. His Justice Department made the same argument about the State Secrets Act, that they won't disclose information about torture against detainees because of claiming state secrets privilege, that the Bush Justice Department made.
Book, The End of America, you note that in September 2006, Congress passed the Military Commission Act. And you said that that law, and I'm quoting you, created a new legal reality that heralds the end of America if Americans do not take action. What do you mean by that?
So the military commissions that Bush and Congress established at Guantanamo, basically the U.S. government is judge, jury, and executioner. It's a military judge and a military panel and a prisoner. And you can't get independent counsel. Your counsel is provided by, people employed by the military. You don't have confidentiality, attorney-client privilege. You can't confide in your attorney. Everyone's bugged all the time. You can't get the documents that you need to defend yourself. And your confession that they're using against you has been tortured out of you. And they can use your confession derived from torture against you, which is illegal in a real jury system, a real civil trial. And again, these military commissions trials are modeled on the People's Court of Hitler, on the Moscow show trials, and on every kangaroo court that any dictator has ever put together subsequently. No rules of evidence, no disclosure. Joe Della Vedova, spokesman for the Department of Defense, he told me, to my astonishment, because this is not common knowledge among news media or the rights community, that they're moving ahead next week with revamped military commissions, rebranded Obama-style military commissions at Guantanamo, with the same failures to provide due process. He said, we're preparing for there to be three categories. Those detainees who are tried in the U.S. in a normal court. Those who are released to other countries, no charges are brought against them. And a third category, he said, who can't be tried and can't be released. Preemptive detention. Held forever. Held forever. Held forever with no trial. No charges, no trial.
Another issue that you wrote about, which I found rather chilling, is the issue of an enemy combatant. Basically, the president, according to what you wrote, can pluck anyone off the street, knock on their door, get them in an airport, and snatch them, and not give a reason, and say they're an enemy combatant. Does Obama have those powers now?
That right still exists. Obama hasn't given it back. And by the way, the founders knew that no matter how well-intentioned a leader is, if you give powers like this, people never give them back. It's not human nature. So what is so disturbing about the indefinite detention claim that Obama is making, coupled with the enemy combatant right that he inherited, is that it means that he can lock any U.S. citizen up forever without a trial. Now, why is this so chilling? If you study history, what you find is that you can't run a police state without that power, but that once you have that power, you can set up a police state very quickly and very effectively. Because what you do is you target key individuals. And you see this in Myanmar, you see it in Thailand, it's like most recently in Iran. You know, 1, 2, 3. You go after the journalists, you go after the opposition leaders, you go after outspoken clergy, you go after union leaders. And if you lock up, you know, a handful of highly visible people indefinitely, everyone goes quiet. You don't need a giant massacre. You don't even need giant prison camps. You just need that one power.
In June, we found out that there are 250,000, 250,000 private contractors right now fighting the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. According to your book and other published reports, other investigators, there's no accountability over them. They can they do whatever they want.
Whatever they want. It's beyond dangerous because the military is minimally accountable to the people. You know, if there's real wrongdoing, Congress can investigate and the laws apply. But with these contractors, I mentioned I was in Guantanamo 2 weeks ago. There are more contractors on Guantanamo than military to a casual observer. And you have functions all over the island that are co-branded, where it'll say, you know, Joint Task Force Guantanamo, the military on one side, and it'll say Burns and Rowe, you know, contractor on the other. And the military people I confronted had to give me some kind of answers. But the contractors who were editing journalists' video, who were confiscating video, who were present when one of the detainees committed suicide, a psychologist who was, I believe, present when a detainee committed suicide, who was not obliged to answer my questions. Can you imagine, you know, medical people, contractors, you know, were building the facility that they said that they were going to close down at the end of the year. Everywhere it was the work of contractors. I would say 60-40. And the thing about the contractors is they don't have to answer my questions or your questions. They wouldn't give me last names. They wouldn't tell me who they worked for. They wouldn't tell me what their function was. When you've got the collusion of medical people in the helping profession in covering up deaths or in torture, you know, you really have crossed over the dark side. And the profit motive of the role of contracting in modern warfare and detention means that there will be increasingly no accountability and that these entities are increasingly driving foreign policy. It's not the U.S. citizens at this point driving foreign policy.
I'd like to give you an update on the Patriot Act. Last year, the Patriot Act was scheduled to be renewed. There was a disagreement between the Senate and the House, and they didn't extend it, but they agreed that this year they would do it. Right now, I think the scheme is that they're going to pass it as quietly as possible. Yet we hear now that there are going to be some meetings this week in the Senate Judiciary Committee, and that they are now planning to get this bill and law renewed. As most of you know, this law was passed shortly after 9/11. It was a perfect example of how we as individuals and Americans have been willing to sacrifice their liberty for so-called security. I consider this an absolute unconstitutional piece of legislation. It shouldn't be extended. It shouldn't be made worse. It actually should be repealed in its entirety, and we'd all be better off for it. But they're not anxious to have open hearings. They're not anxious to have a new debate. They consider that opening up a can of worms, but it's a can of worms that deserves to be opened because it affects all of us as Americans. And all of us who believe in liberty and believe the rule of law have to be concerned about the Patriot Act. It's a great issue as far as I'm concerned because it can bring together a good group of people, both from the conservatives as well as liberals, because we do believe in this case that individual liberty ought to be protected. So keep an eye on this, and understand that the people at the Campaign for Liberty will try to keep you with updates on their website. Thank you.